The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right in saying that we are leaving a dysfunctional union, the European Union, and that is an opportunity for the people of Scotland. But is it not also the case that if we were to follow the Scottish National Party's advocacy and leave the union that works the United Kingdom, we would land the people of Scotland with a huge public sector deficit and the prospect of either tax rises or cuts in services?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and it does seem to me to be a very strange contradiction that members on the benches opposite are rightly so concerned about Scotland's continued trade with the EU, but they disregard the fact that Scotland's trade with the rest of the United Kingdom is 4 times as much as with the EU, and that 1 million jobs in Scotland are dependent on our trade within the United Kingdom. That's the union that matters to Scotland.
Ian Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the importance of that single market to Scotland, does my right honourable friend agree that the last thing the Scottish economy needs is a perpetual uncertainty of another independence referendum?
Mr. Speaker, if anyone who actually listens to businesses in Scotland and indeed to the people of Scotland, it is quite clear that people do not want another divisive independence referendum in Scotland, other than individuals who are obsessed with independence. We need to listen to business, take a second independence referendum off the table and concentrate on getting the best possible deal for Scotland and the UK from these negotiations.
Mr. David Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a result of demands from Nissan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has suggested that companies who will suffer a loss in profits as a result of exiting the EU may be due compensation. Can the Secretary of State assure businesses based in Scotland who will suffer the same loss in profits that they will be entitled to the same deal? And if that's the case, has he made an assessment of the cost of such compensation?
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by congratulating the honourable gentleman on retaining his position as a shadow Scottish Secretary. I understand that on the benches behind him is the Westminster spokesman of the Scottish Labour Party, and I'm sure it will emerge during these questions how those two positions interrelate. The point that I would make in response to his question is that we will have a common response across the United Kingdom, and whatever support is put in place for businesses in the north of England will apply for businesses in Scotland.
Kinley.
Has a long and proud history of invention, innovation and creativity, and has always looked out to the world. Could the government do more to rekindle that outlook in Scotland, rather than the First Minister creating uncertainty and constantly talking about independence?
Mr. Speaker, I agree that we need to see Brexit as an opportunity, and I was very interested to see yesterday that the leader of Glasgow City Council also took that view, that Brexit offered an opportunity for Glasgow to continue to flourish. So rather than doom-mongering, which is the constant refrain of the SNP, let's take a positive approach and let's seize the opportunities that are out there for Scotland.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
May I remind the Secretary of State for Scotland that he was elected on a manifesto commitment to, and I quote, safeguard British interests in the single market. So will he and his government work with the Scottish Government, respect the 62% of Scottish voters who voted to remain within the European Union, and protect our place in Europe?
Of course I'll do that, but I'll also respect the half of voters in his own constituency who voted to leave the EU. The right honourable gentleman doesn't make much of it, Mr. Speaker, but a higher percentage of people in his constituency voted to leave the EU than voted for him. So let's respect everybody in this debate. I'm committed I'm committed to working with the Scottish Government. I've met Michael Russell on a number of occasions. The First Minister and the Prime Minister will meet on the 24th of October, and their engagement will be essential to achieving what we want, the best possible deal for Scotland.
Robertson.
We learnt from statistics emanating from his own government the cost of Brexit will cost £66 billion a year. Now, if these statistics are being prepared for the Cabinet Office, surely they're also being prepared for the Scotland Office. So will the Secretary of State for Scotland be candid with the House and candid with the people of Scotland and tell us how much will Brexit cost Scotland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not even at the stage of beginning the negotiations. What we're going to see, and the Prime Minister has set out the process for taking those negotiations forward. It's inevitable that over the next few weeks, months and years, we're going to see press reports, press speculation, leaks, and all sorts of other supposition. What I want to do is to ensure that going into those negotiations, we do so in conjunction with the Scottish Government to get the best possible deal, and that's what my commitment is.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Secretary of State seen the report published yesterday by the NAFC Marine Centre showing that 1/2 of all demersal fish and 2/3 of all pelagic fish caught in UK waters were caught by boats from other EU countries. Does he understand why Scottish fishermen see these negotiations as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to undo the damage caused by the common fisheries policy? And will he put these interests at the heart of the negotiations, unlike his Tory predecessors from the 1970s, who saw our fishing industry as being expendable?
Mr. Speaker, I commend the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and others as to their approach in relation to the negotiations. They see the negotiations as an opportunity for the very reasons that he refers to and yesterday's report. And I think they were quite right to characterise yesterday's report as a sea of opportunity, and they will have my support in achieving that.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his assessment of the impact on the Scottish economy of the UK leaving the EU, has it included an assessment of the impact of Scotland leaving its biggest single market, the rest of the UK, something some people are demanding week in and week out?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my earlier comments, I find it very surprising that people who set out a great enthusiasm for the European single market at the same time are willing to dismiss the United Kingdom single market, which is worth 4 times as much to the Scottish economy and employs 1 million Scottish people in jobs.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's GDP figures in Scotland are welcome, and the major increase in GDP is a result of the services sector, probably driven by the financial services sector in Scotland and indeed in my own city of Edinburgh. So what is specifically the Secretary of State doing to protect that financial services sector, and can he give the House and Scotland an assurance that he will stand by the Conservative Party's commitment in his manifesto from 2015 that he says yes to the single market?
Firstly, Mr. Speaker, we fully recognise the importance of the financial services sector, not just in Edinburgh but in Scotland more generally. I'm determined that their interests are protected. We are working very closely with them to ensure that they are very much to the forefront as we move forward with establishing the UK's negotiating position.
Mr. Crisfield.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 3, 6 and 7 together. Since the EU referendum, Scotland Office Ministers have held over 50 meetings with Scottish Government Ministers, Scottish organisations and trade bodies to discuss the implications for Scotland. We intend to hold further such meetings in the coming months to ensure that Scottish business interests are fully represented in the negotiations on the UK's exit from the EU and in any future trade arrangements.
Mr. Phil.
Does my right honourable friend agree that when we negotiate free trade deals outside of the European Union, we can remove some of the protectionist tariff barriers the EU has erected, thereby reducing consumer prices for consumers in Scotland and indeed across the whole United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, I do agree with my honourable friend, and I believe that this government and this country can be an advocate around the world for free trade. Trade liberalisation between advanced economies can have a positive impact on the consumer, and that's what we want to see in Scotland and across the UK.
Mr. Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker, can the Secretary of State reassure the House that as he's conducting those discussions around the world, engaged with British business, he does two things. First of all, he gets the maximum opportunities for Scottish business, but also uses it as an opportunity to demonstrate that Scotland is better as part of the United Kingdom and knock on the head all this talk of independence, which we incessantly hear from the party opposite.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my right honourable friend. I think it's vital that we promote Scotland's interests in that way, but that we do so working in conjunction with the Scottish Government. Both governments can have a role to play, for example, as the Scotch Whisky Association has identified in developing new markets and promoting that vitally important product for Scotland's economy.
James Berry.
Mr. Speaker, on the theme of Scotch whisky, I was pleased to read last month that exports of Scotch whisky are up for the first time in 3 years, with a surge of exports to India. Does my right honourable friend agree that the UK should work together to support the export of great British products, including great Scottish products like whisky?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do, as I've just set out in my previous remarks, and bodies such as the Scotch Whisky Association acknowledge and accept that, and they want to see the two governments working together in that regard, and that's what I'm committed to doing.
Wayne David.
Hi. If the government leaves the European Union without a specific trade arrangement with the EU, is he quite happy to fall back on WTO organisation methods?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that that's the type of speculation that will be constantly sought from ministers over the weeks and months ahead. The Prime Minister has set out the process for negotiating our exit from the EU, and at the conclusion of that process, I am confident we will be able to have achieved the best possible deal for Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Dr. Amy Whiteford.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has on many occasions in the past extolled the trade benefits of the single market to Scotland. So regardless of whether the UK is a member state of the EU or not, does he still believe it's in Scotland's interest to have membership of the single market rather than trying to negotiate third-party access?
What I've also said, as the Honourable Lady will know on many occasions, is that the United Kingdom will have a bespoke arrangement with the EU when we leave. And it's not appropriate or sensible to see the negotiating process in the context of existing arrangements or that have been done with other countries, or indeed the existing structure of the EU. What we should look to do is to get the best possible deal for our businesses.
David Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Crucial to promoting trade is the need to support apprenticeships. However, training bodies, their organisations, business and employees in Scotland are telling me they are struggling to get clear guidance on how the apprenticeship levy will work in Scotland. Can he ensure that, unlike his colleague, the Business Secretary, he works urgently with the Scottish Government to give these people the information they need?
I'm absolutely committed to doing that, and I can confirm that the apprenticeship levy will be discussed when the Joint Ministerial Council meets on the 24th of October.
David Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the areas in which these apprenticeships could work will be in the decommissioning of the oil industry and the oil rigs. We've already seen the loss of 80,000 jobs in that industry, which will be compounded if we continue, as has happened recently, to lose contracts for decommissioning to other countries. Does the Government have any strategy at all whatsoever to ensure these crucial jobs remain in Scottish hands?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman will know that the government is committed to the industry. Its £2.3 billion investment and associated tax changes were exactly what the industry asked in terms of support. We've also established, along with the Scottish Government, the £250 million Aberdeen City deal, which will have at its heart a new technology centre to ensure that skills and jobs remain in the North East.
Henry Smith.
Mr. Speaker, a significant number of new welfare powers came into force this September and give the Scottish Parliament new choices over welfare in Scotland. The Joint Ministerial Working Group on Welfare, which includes Scottish ministers, met yesterday to continue its important and constructive work overseeing the transfer of the remaining powers.
Henry Smith.
With that significant transfer of powers from the UK Government to Edinburgh, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the Scottish Government should get on with exercising those powers for the sake of the welfare of the people of Scotland, rather than wasting time on expensive and unnecessary talk of second independence referendums?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. These are significant powers which the Scottish Government and the Scottish National Party in this House asked for. I think people around Scotland will be looking to see how they are being deployed and what process is being used. And I think the message coming from the people of Scotland generally to the Scottish Government is get on with the day job.
Neil Gray.
Much, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure yesterday at the Joint Ministerial Working Group, the Scottish ministers would have stressed their desire to see their employment programmes on a voluntary basis. What steps will the Secretary of State for Scotland take to ensure his government respects that desire?
Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, we've made it absolutely clear that we will respect the desire for the programmes to proceed on a voluntary basis, and that's been made clear. What I think the people of Scotland will want to know is what the Scottish Government intends to do in relation to people who don't volunteer to be part of the programme.
Menzies.
Question number 8, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer this question together with question 10. The Government continues to work very closely with industry, both directly and through the Oil and Gas Authority, to drive investment and support jobs in the North Sea.
Mark Menzies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Revenue from North Sea oil has dropped by more than £10 billion over the course of the last 2 years. What steps is the Government taking to ensure that the public services in Scotland don't suffer as a result of the shortfall in public revenue?
Well, as my colleague rightly notes, there has been a shock from global changes in the oil and gas industry. As the latest public finance figures show, being part of the UK protects living standards in Scotland. This drop in revenues has been offset by a vigorous programme of government support in tax relief and allowances, as well as a host of other areas.
Mr. Graham Evan. The supply of homegrown feedstocks is vital for the Cheshire chemical industry and is in part unreliable on the success of the North Sea oil and gas. Can the Minister assure the House that the Government will continue to take steps to support the many jobs of our foundation industries that depend very much on this sector?
Well, my colleague is absolutely right to highlight this issue. The UK chemical sector is a vital part of our manufacturing industry and a very important contributor to the economy. Government's working very closely with the industry to implement the desire to grow gross value added by £105 billion by 2030. A key element of that will be in delivering competitive energy and feedstock supplies.
Callum McCaig.
Industry has been crystal clear that more work needs to be done to boost exploration. In the autumn statement, will this government bring forward exploration incentives to protect employment and boost production?
Exploration remains a very important part. Of course, the continental shelf is depleting. The government's taken some serious steps, as you know, in this area, as the gentleman will know, in this area in Aberdeen with the City deal. And I'm not going to comment on the autumn statement, but it's an issue of some focus for the government.
Yes, Mr. Grant. Peter Grant.
Mr. Speaker, since question time began this morning, Mr. Speaker, 5 members on these benches have asked about membership of the European Union. 2 have asked about Scottish jobs.
7 members on the Conservative benches want to talk about Scottish independence. Picture these with the Secretary of State described as being obsessed with independence.
I could do no better than refer the honourable gentleman to the words of Adam Smith, Mr. Speaker, when he said that the Union of 1707 was a measure from which infinite good has been derived to Scotland.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Question number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Order! Far too much noise in the chamber. The Minister is a debutant at the box. He ought to be heard. Mr. Jesse Norman.
Not quite a debutante, Minister, but we can only hope. The steel industry in Scotland remains a vital part of the UK steel industry as a whole. Government continues to engage with steel companies, devolved governments and trade unions to install a prosperous and sustainable industry for the UK in future.
Andrew Murison.
Liberty House is taking more than 70% of its new workforce from among former Tata Steel employees. It is to be congratulated for that, which is good news for Motherwell. But will my honourable friend particularly congratulate the company for its apprenticeship programme, which is a positive endorsement of Britain's engineering future?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to focus on the Dalzell plate mill, which opened last month under its new owners, Liberty Group, with the support of the government. As this illustrates, in supporting British Steel, we've taken clear action to help the industry, including securing state aid to compensate for energy costs, flexibility over EU emissions regulations and many other areas, and I share his delight in the work that's been done with apprenticeships as well.
Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During recess, I attended the reopening of DL Works in Motherwell. Will the Minister speak to the Scottish Government on how you can save jobs in steel by putting together a package that really works?
Very good.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady. The government stands ready to work together with the Scottish Government on any area that can support and protect Scottish jobs and Scottish industry.
Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Paula Sheriff.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Paula Sheriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I previously worked in an NHS service which the Coalition Government gifted to Virgin Care, who are now seeking another contract covering my constituency. Amongst many unethical practices I witnessed, Virgin imposed a system of double appointments, forcing patients to have unnecessary extra consultations before surgery, boosting their profits at the expense of the taxpayer and of patient safety. Is this acceptable? And if not, what is the Prime Minister prepared to do about it?
Well, of course, what we want to see in the provision of local services is the best services possible for local people. But the honourable lady talks about outsourcing of services in the NHS. I have to say to her that the party that actually put greater privatisation into the NHS was not this party, it was the Labour Party.
Question 2, closed question, Mr. Michael Fabricant.
12 months ago, I went to see...
This stage, yes. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The West Midlands economy, I have to say, is in a very positive position at the moment. I'm very pleased to say that since 2010, nearly 200,000 more people are at work there, 42,000 new businesses. I saw the strength of the economy when I was in Birmingham last week. Of course, we're giving the West Midlands new powers with the devolution deal and the election of a mayor, and I have to say that Andy Street, with his business experience and local experience, would be a very good mayor for the West Midlands.
Mr. Michael Fabricant.
On the subject of the NHS, 18 months ago, my wonderful doctor, Helen Stokes Lampard, suggested I have a general well-manned checkup. And it's just as well that I did, because the blood test revealed that there could have been, and was, a problem with my prostate, despite the fact that I was symptom-free. I was immediately referred to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, who are simply wonderful, and after a period of surveillance, I had a prostatectomy back in June. But hey, I'm now fine. But I want to thank the whole team at the QE, including my surgeon, Alan Doherty, and my excellent specialist prostate nurse, Richard Gledhill, who gave me practical advice. But in the next 10 years, there will be a real shortage of specialist prostate and urology nurses, as many are due for retirement. So may I ask the Prime Minister, what can the government do to avert a shortage of these much-needed nurses? Well,
Can I say to my honourable friend that a whole House is pleased to see him back in his position as his normal exuberant self in this House. But he raises a very serious issue, and can I join him in commending not only those doctors and nurses and other health service staff who treated him for his prostate cancer, but those doctors and nurses who are day in and day out ensuring that, as we see actually, we are now having cancer survival rates at a record high. The government is putting more money into awareness of cancer problems, and we will look at those, the training of nurses. There are 50,000 nurses in training, and we'll continue to make sure that the specialisms are available to do the work that is necessary in the health service.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too join the Prime Minister in wishing the member for Lichfield well, and obviously hope the treatment he got is the same as treatment that everybody else got, because we want good treatment for everybody in our society. It's not controversial. I'm just wishing him well. Is that okay? Sorry to start on such a controversial note, Mr. Speaker. I do apologise. At the Conservative Party conference, the Prime Minister said she wants Britain to be a country where it doesn't matter where you were born. But the Home Secretary's flagship announcement was to name and shame companies that employ foreign workers. Could the Prime Minister explain why where someone was born clearly does matter to members of her cabinet?
First of all, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, congratulations on winning the Labour leadership election. Can I welcome him back to his place in this House as his normal self? Can I say to him that the policy that he has just described was never the policy that the Home Secretary announced? There was no naming and shaming, no published list of foreign workers, no published data. What we are going to consult on is whether we should bring ourselves in line with countries like the United States of America, which collect data in order to be able to ensure that they're getting the right skills training for workers in their economy.
Mr. Speaker, I am most grateful to the over 300,000 people that voted for me to become the leader of my party. Mr. Speaker, is rather more than voted for her to become leader of her party. She seems to be slightly unaware of what's going on. First, the Home Secretary. First, Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary briefed that companies would be named and shamed. The Education Secretary clarified that data would only be kept by government. And yesterday, Number 10 said it was for consultation. And the Home Secretary clarified the whole matter by saying it's one of the tools we're going to use. This government has no answers, Mr. Speaker, just gimmicks and scapegoats. Yesterday, we learnt that pregnant women will be forced to hand over their passports at NHS hospitals, no ultrasound without photographic ID, heavily pregnant women sent home on icy roads to get a passport. Are these really the actions of a country where it doesn't matter where you were born?
Well, I've made absolutely clear about the policy that the Home Secretary set out. But I'd just say to the right honourable gentleman, he raises issues around the health service. I think it is right that we should say that we ensure that when we're providing health services to people, that they are free at the point of delivery, that they are eligible to have those services. That where there are people in this country who come to this country to use our health service and who should be paying for it, that the health service actually identifies those people and makes sure that it gets the money from them. I would have thought that would be an uncontroversial view. Of course, emergency care will be provided when necessary, absolutely without those questions. But what is important is that we ensure where people should be paying because they don't have the right to access to free care in the health service, they do.
Jeremy Corbyn. Some of her colleagues on the Leave side, Mr. Speaker, promised us £350 million a week extra for the NHS. She doesn't seem to have answers to the big questions facing Britain. On Monday, the Secretary for Brexit, when questioned about the government's approach to the single market access, replied, "We need hard data about the size of the problem in terms of both money and jobs." It would have been much easier if he'd simply asked his colleague, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, because he would have been able to tell him that the Treasury forecast is a £66 billion loss to the economy, 7.5% of the GDP. Can the Prime Minister now confirm that access to the single market is a red line for the government, or is it not?
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman has asked me this question before, and yes. He says it's a simple question, and I will give him the simple answer. What we are going to do is deliver on the vote of the British people to leave the European Union. What we are going to do is be ambitious in our negotiations to negotiate the best deal for the British people, and that will include the maximum possible access to the European market for firms to trade with and operate within the European market. But I'm also clear that the vote of the British people said that we should control the movement of people from the EU into the UK, and unlike the Right Honourable Gentleman, we believe we should deliver on what the British people want.
Someone once said that leaving the single market would risk a loss of investors and business, and we risk going backwards when it comes to international trade. That person is now the Prime Minister, and that was before the referendum. The Japanese government, Mr. Speaker, the Japanese government, Mr. Speaker, wrote to her in September worried about a shambolic Brexit. Many Japanese companies are major investors in Britain, such as Nissan in Sunderland, which has already halted its investment. 140,000 people in Britain work for Japanese-owned companies. They've made it clear that those jobs and investment depends on single market access. What reassurance can she give to workers today desperately worried about their future, their company and their jobs?
First of all, say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that the biggest vote of confidence that we had in Britain after the referendum vote came was £24 billion investment from a Japanese company, SoftBank, in taking over Arm. But secondly, in relation to what we're doing in our negotiations, he doesn't seem to get what the future is going to be about. The UK will be leaving the European Union. We're not asking ourselves what bits of membership we want to retain. We're saying what is the right relationship for the UK to have to the maximum benefit of our economy and citizens of this country.
Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Speaker, the member for Broxtowe said there is a danger that this government appeared to be turning their back on the single market, which was indeed a commitment in the Conservative Party manifesto. The reality is that since the Brexit vote, the trade deficit is widening, growth forecasts being downgraded, value of the pound down 16%, an alliance of the Chamber of Commerce, Confederation of British Industry, British Retail Consortium and Trade Union Congress have all made representations to the Prime Minister demanding clarity. Is the Prime Minister really willing to risk a shambolic Tory Brexit just to appease the people behind her?
What the Conservative Party committed to in its manifesto was to give the British people a referendum on whether to stay in the European Union. We gave the British people that vote. They have given their decision. We will be leaving the European Union, and in doing that we will negotiate the right deal for the UK, which means the right deal in terms of operating within and trading with the European market. That's what matters to companies here in the UK, and that's what we're going to be ambitious about delivering.
Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe often has a mot juste to help us in these debates. And he simply said...
I want to hear about the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Rushcliffe.
Very long way, Mr. Speaker, and what he said was, in his own inimitable way, the reason the pound keeps zooming south is that absolutely nobody has the faintest idea what exactly we're going to put in place. Yeah. We on these benches do respect the decision of the British people to leave the European Union. But this is a government that drew up no plans for Brexit, that now has no strategy for negotiating Brexit, and offers no clarity, no transparency, and no chance of scrutiny of the process for developing a strategy. The jobs and incomes of millions of our people are at stake. The pound is plummeting, business is worrying, and the government has no answers. The Prime Minister says she won't give a running commentary. But isn't it time the government stopped running away from the looming threat to jobs and businesses in this country and the living standards of millions of people?
Unlike the Right Honourable Gentleman, I'm optimistic about the prospects of this country once we leave the European Union. I'm optimistic about the trade deals that other countries now actively are coming to us to say that they want to do with the United Kingdom. And I'm optimistic about how we will be able to ensure that our economy grows outside of the European Union. But I have to say to the Right Honourable Gentleman on this issue, Labour didn't want a referendum on this issue. We gave them, the Conservatives gave them a referendum. Labour didn't like the result. We are listening to the British people and delivering on that result. And now the Shadow Foreign Secretary is shouting from a sedentary position. The Shadow Foreign Secretary